And so, as promised, today we've got Brookline resident and Tufts political science professor Eitan Hersh, who wrote a book. It's worth reading. You can get it at Booksmith. Perhaps it's available at the public library. Definitely worth checking it out. I'm sure Eitan Hersh would tell you to buy it, but you're welcome to borrow it. You can even borrow this copy if you're desperate. Politics is for Power. Eitan, thanks for coming on the show. And first, why don't you tell us about your experience in Brookline? How long have you been in Brookline? What are you thinking about? Are you involved in anything locally? You know, what's your deal, man?
Sure. Good question. So I came to Brookline across the river in 2011 when I finished my PhD. And we came to Brookline. My wife was born and raised on Beacon Street. And we were very happy to move to Brookline, and we live there ever since. Yeah, I spend a lot of my free time in civic ventures in Brookline, including running the children's programming for one of the synagogues in town as a volunteer. I spent a lot of time in the last couple months on Brookline Select Board's task force for reimagining policing. If you ever come onto the big stream for that, you see me there. And then I'm also involved on the board of Brookline for Everyone, an organization focused on affordable housing. So yes, I spend a lot of my evenings on Zoom conversations with other people in Brookline.
So it sounds like you may have read this book called Politics is for Power that you also happen to write. And we're laughing about it. Maybe folks don't know the punchline. Tell us about political hobbyism, which is not what you just described at all. Tell us about what it means to be a political hobbyist and how that may have changed over the past 5 or 10 years.
Well, I was doing some academic research and looking at the ways that ordinary people participate in politics. It's one of the interest areas I have in academia. And, what I kind of discovered is if you look at how regular people participate in politics, I'm not talking people who are disengaged, don't follow news. I'm thinking about the people who spend an hour or 2 hours a day cognitively engaged in politics. I came up with this term political hobbyism for what describes most of their behaviors. That is, it's mostly activities that are focused on emotional and intellectual self-gratification, and it's not real politics, right? So when I say politics is for power, which is the title of the book, it makes people a little uncomfortable. Like, what does that even mean? Well, doing politics is working with other people with some goal and some strategy to influence the government. If you're not doing that, you're not doing politics. And politics is also about power relationships, meaning if I want Representative Vitolo to do something that he's not going to otherwise do, and I can get him to do that, then I exert some power. Just like I exert power over my children if I can get them into the bath and they don't want to do that, or over another voter who wouldn't vote or wouldn't cast a ballot unless I help them. Those are power relationships. And so if we're doing politics and we have a goal and we have a strategy and we're getting other people, either elected officials or bureaucrats or voters, to do something, then we're really doing politics. But all the news consumption, all of the partisan cheerleading, all of the online punditry, that is what I call hobbyism.
So this is like, I'm a Boston Celtics fan. I watch the games. I read about it. Right, I get on the chat lines. I follow the Twitter stream. And when the Celtics win the championship, I say, "We won!" And you come along and say, "Wait a minute, you have a hobby. You didn't win anything. The Celtics won, and you watched." But that's not what you described you doing in Brookline, right? What you described for yourself, the things that you're involved in are activities where you're working with other people, and it sounds like at least you're trying to influence policy. Whether or not you've been successful to date, I don't know. But you're working with others and trying to influence politics. And so I was thinking about your book, over the past week and thinking about the insurrection at the Capitol and what different people were thinking about on Wednesday morning. Trump supporters who knew they were going to be on the sidewalk and are convinced, probably through social media, that the election was rigged. Well, and I was thinking, how much of their participation is stemming from the hobby? I don't want to say you're denigrating the hobbyism, but pointing out that it's not really politics. How much of the social media got them to be standing in a sidewalk in DC rather than their homes in, Somerville or Hampton Roads, Virginia, wherever it is they came from?
Yeah, it's interesting because protests are complicated. People go to protests of all kinds for really different reasons. You can think of someone going to a protest on the left, like the Women's March was about this time 4 years ago. The March for Science. And they might have no goal other than to kind of be a spectator, to be part of a crowd, to feel connected to other people. But the organizers might have a goal, right? The organizers might say, okay, we're going to make it fun, so you will come to this thing. But really, our goal is recruitment. We're trying to get you signed up to do real work. And indeed, like a lot of people who went to the Women's March, for example, that was like their first step into real politics. It was a recruitment step. And when I think about my work, I really feel honored to be part of the task force reimagining Brookline. And that started with me going to one of the Black Lives Matter rallies we had on the steps of the library here, and select board member Fernandez saying, don't make this the last thing you do. If you really are interested in this issue, we need you. And I took that seriously. So protests can be recruitment, but from the perspective of any one individual, they might just be for fun. They might be no strategy. And indeed, like a lot of people will go to a lot of protests and they never are recruited into anything and they never take another step. And for them, the whole thing is kind of a hobby. So I think if you think of the insurrection, the protest or the riot that happened last week, there's so many combinations of things. Some people saw that there was going to be a scene, and it was a scene that they wanted to be part of. It might be people who are fairly disconnected from other people in a real in-person community. It's COVID, they don't have lots of human connection. And someone says, get on this bus and be with all these other people. And that feels great. And maybe other people have a strategy. The organizers might have a strategy. President Trump might have a strategy. And so the relationship between kind of leaders and followers in a protest is really complicated. When things break down into riots, right, you don't need a leader to be in a riot. In fact, like when you have riots like that, it could be a purposeful coup of the government. And I think this is a really complicated thing to talk about, especially just a few days after it's happened. But we could think of it as a purposeful strategic thing, and we might find more evidence of that. But we also think of it as the absence of leadership, that there was no adult in the room. There was no one channeling activist energy productively. And when that happens, when people are kind of unmoored from leadership, dangerous things happen.
So we had this circumstance where I expect it to be the case that many of the participants are the kind of hobbyists you describe, right? They're consuming news from narrow slivers of sources and sort of stuck in this spiral of believing the worst out of some things and the best out of other things and ignoring everything in the middle. And somehow or other, thousands of people traveled across the country to this event on January 6th. And I expect that many of them did not anticipate leaving the sidewalk. That was never part of their plan. They hadn't even considered it up until the moment that it happened. And they found themselves doing something that perhaps in hindsight, they now see was a terrible, terrible thing to do. Some may not. And so what I'm wondering is, right, somebody either willfully or through luck was able to harness the hobbyism and use it for power, right? Which is sort of bending my mind. I'm thinking about the hobbyism and I'm thinking about productive politics for power. And this sort of merged them in a way that I hadn't anticipated. Can you talk a little bit about what it means to sort of take power over the hobbyists and actually do a thing, whether or not it's a good thing, and they did a thing.
Yeah. So, I mean, there's a few pieces we want to break down here, right? One is the thing that happens online. If all of your political consumption is online, that is about polarization, about what you think of your political opponents, right? So, in the kind of politics that you're engaged in, Tommy, or that I like to think I'm engaged in here in Brookline, the people who disagree with me are people who are pretty similar to me. The people who are on the other side of housing issues and here in Brookline or policing issues are my neighbors, and they're mostly Democrats. And whether they're Democrats, Republicans, Independents, they're not lunatics, they are my neighbors. And when you're thinking about politics in concrete ways like that, that's what happens. I think that's what happens at the State House. I think that's what happens in local communities across the country. When all of your news consumption is focused on national politics, and when you're getting your sources of news from these niche news sites that are designed to encourage obsessiveness, then the other side is not your neighbors. They are evildoers, and they're stupid, and they're terrible. And so if that is the whole sense of which you're getting news, you can be radicalized and think the other people on the other side are crazy and stupid and evil. That's step one, right? Then the second thing that's happened is organization, right? And this is sort of something you mentioned. So one thing, obviously, the internet is very good of, whether it's for dating or finding people who have very niche hobbies or politics, is it finds people who are like-minded, who are, they could be all living in their parents' basement, and connects them together. And so, look, I just did a survey. We're going to have data on this pretty soon. But something like 10% of young people identify as the alt-right. 10% of people 18 to 30 identify as part of the alt-right. 20% of people 18 to 30 identify as leftists. 20% of people 18 to 30 identify as socialists. Those are overlapping categories. Select all that apply, right? But you have 10% of people who say identify as alt-right, and they're scattered throughout the country. But when they can find social media sites that connect them, then they can engage in collective action. Okay, so you have people who are able to organize for certain forms of collective action. They're from all over the country, and they can come together because they're radicalized by their news. But the thing that makes this still within the hobbyist framework is that it's not really possible to do constructive politics like that. We could divide politics into destructive and constructive, right? As you know, at the State House, it's very easy to squash something, and it's much harder to accomplish something. I assume that you agree with that statement. And there's a lot of people out there in politics who their main goal is either to prevent any change, right, or to really be destructive. When I think about what happened last week, I think about a parallel that happened in the Arab Spring, which some people remember, the set of revolutions that happened over a fairly short period of time in a number of Arab countries. And one of the epicenters of the Arab Spring was in Egypt. Now, what happened in Egypt? What happened in Egypt is that young people, a lot of college-educated people, organized protests, big, massive protests in Tahrir Square in Cairo, and they were able to get people into this place. They were able to get supplies, food, pharmacy supplies to get into this protest. And they had this massive protest, and they brought down an authoritarian regime. Now, in some ways, we can think about that as a destructive force. They kind of took down the incumbent government. And then after the Arab Spring, what happened? I mean, after that, there was an election. And that group of people who organized the protest very, very effectively, they got people there, they took down the government, they couldn't do the next step, which was getting votes, getting people to participate in votes. And they lost handily in an election. This is the sort of the young, liberal, secular crowd. They lost to the Muslim Brotherhood, which was both interested and had for a long time been providing social services to people, education services, healthcare services, and cultivated a strategy for getting out the vote. And so once the Arab Spring in Egypt turned from protest to constructive, get people out to vote, have people do something, the energy that was behind the whole protest collapsed, right? And so here you can get, so now bringing us, and by the way, like in the end, the Arab Spring was incredibly destructive, that a lot of governments were brought down. And what was put into place after that? Dictatorships. In most countries, vicious crackdowns. So, if you look back now, just a few years later at the Arab Spring, you wouldn't think, wow, the internet, helped revolutionaries topple authoritarian regimes. You would think, wow, the internet broke stuff, but didn't fix stuff. And I think it's useful to think about that in the context of what just happened last week. The internet helped people come together without much notice, without much expense, to come to Washington and engage in a protest that could have led to even more massive destruction. But those people are not going to be able to and haven't been able to get the vote out. They haven't been able to, you can't get those people on a bus to Georgia to knock on doors. You can't get those people to city council meetings to pass new legislation. Thank God you can't. But the flip side of that is it's very hard to leverage the hobbyist energy on any side, left or right, into productive either electioneering, grassroots organizing, or into lobbying, lawmaking, policy change. So I think there's so many dimensions in which we can think about what happened last week, but I think the one is the nationalization and polarization that happens online. Two is this idea that we can, the internet can gather, even if it's 5%, 10% of the public who are all over the country and by themselves have no power, but it can organize them. And the last thing is that it can get that energy if people are kind of just doing this for fun, to be part of a scene, to be part of a crowd, that's where you can be destructive. But if it's like to be part of an organization, to be part of a strategy, it's not going to be so good for that. You need kind of real human relationships for that.
So I want to acknowledge there's an interesting difference, to me at least, between an election and the governing that follows. And so when you talked about the Trump supporters who were protesters who got on a bus, you said it's not easy to get them to Georgia to get out the vote. And then you said it's not easy to get them to a city council meeting. I would actually agree with the latter, but I'm not so sure about the former, because getting out the vote, for some people, the candidate and their team and, what I would call professionals, is a process, right? Is a thing that you plan for, and you have stages, right? But for volunteers, it actually can feel like a small number of events, and you just get enough volunteers and there's always some around. And I wonder, aren't political hobbyists potentially really useful for something like a Georgia Senate runoff campaign? And maybe were political hobbyists an important part of the success or failure of any of the four candidates in the Georgia Senate race?
Yes, for now. But here, I think I want to make the distinction of what real kind of deep political participation is versus Band-Aid participation. So as a political scientist, the way I think about all voter engagement that's like knocking on doors, phone banking, writing letters, like a lot of people up here wrote letters or postcards. By the way, not like knocking on doors as a candidate, but as a volunteer. Anytime a volunteer is interacting with a stranger, that is already a Band-Aid. It's a triage for a lack of an actual relationship. So, think about, I'll give you a personal example. Here in Brookline, before a local election, I'll usually send 100 neighbors or so my slate of candidates who I'm voting for. Now, who are those 100 people? Mostly actually people I know from religious community. And maybe 20 of them will walk into the polling place with my slate and they'll vote that way. Why? Are they duped? Are they tricked? No, we're friends. They defer to me on this because I follow it a little more than them. And maybe one of them's a doctor, and I'll bring my kid to get his head looked at by the doctor friend, and he'll defer to me on the politics, right? That is, and we have shared values and trust. So when in that context, and suggesting folks who to vote for, that goes so much farther than the 0.1% increase that you might get, of course, from a postcard or something like that, from strangers talking to strangers. The other thing that happens is I'm going to send that email every election, no matter if the Democrats are up or down, whether the candidates are exciting or not exciting. But the energy around canvassing or phone banking or letter writing is highly variable depending on which party is cool, which time is exciting. I mean, in the book, I talk a lot about that example of the Scott Brown special election here in Massachusetts. It's just, 15 months after the 2008 election, where the Democrats were just like high on, doing everything. And then now Massachusetts really mattered, and turnout collapses, especially in the Democratic areas, right? We have a lot of energy right now. I don't think there's a political scientist in America who thinks the Democrats are going to keep the House of Representatives in 2022. It's basically, it's almost impossible to imagine how they would. The president's party always loses a few seats. The Democrats only have a few more seats than Republicans. And partly that's going to happen because the hobbyist energy goes away. And so, if you think about, generally speaking, what we have on the right and left in politics is the right is filled with people like me who have a lot of church relationships. They don't have to go and knock on the doors of strangers. That's for the amateurs. They have friends, and they have friends who are in their community. It's not like they have, a random dude who they know on Facebook. It's like they know 100 people in their town. And, that is the thing that has really declined, particularly on the Democratic side. But I think it's probably true among the group who is the kind of the insurrectionists last week. I mean, I think that we'll find those are the kinds of people who say they'll identify as Christian conservative, but don't go to church. They are not deep into community. They are apart from community, and that's where you get this kind of politics, and then the kind of just like powerless form of politics that I think we see among the hobbyists.
So that's an interesting idea that I'm going to use my words, not yours. That many of the participants are socially isolated to more extent than typical. These are a similar profile as sort of the loners who are having trouble, and they're making this connection online with other people who are struggling in the same way. I don't know if that will turn out to be true or not. I think that's really interesting, and frankly brave to make such a prediction. We'll learn more in the weeks to come, aided in fact by the fact that so many people who went into the Capitol went ahead and posted their experience on Parler or Facebook or something. The FBI is paying attention to all of that, of course. So what happens now to politics now that this has happened with respect to social media and hobbyism? Does this change how people think about political hobbyism, how they participate with social media, or is this just kind of another chapter in the book, but the book is going to keep going?
So look, I mean, I think that for a number of people on the left, Trump's election in 2016 was a moment where they said, I can't be a hobbyist anymore. I need to be involved in my community. Now, in the grand scheme of all the people who got obsessed with, Rachel Maddow, whose ratings went through the roof, who got obsessed with Twitter, it's a tiny number of people. We're still talking just, 5% or something. It's a small number of people who felt, I need to do something. But it was still some people. And I think this is another moment where we're already seeing, we're seeing business leaders that were either completely apathetic, indifferent, closed their eyes to this, or abetted it by supporting members of Congress who were very clearly for a long time unpatriotic in their disregard for the voting rights of their fellow Americans and so forth. So I think some of those business leaders are saying, some of the, maybe some of them are not genuine. They're saying, oh, well, now that Trump's leaving, I'll support what the Democrats want. I think a number of them are saying, holy moly, our country is in trouble if we don't take ourselves more seriously as citizens, as civic leaders, as business leaders, as community leaders. And I hope that trickles down to more everyday people who, need to play a longer game and a more thoughtful game about how they engage politically, so that, we can counteract this stuff.
I hope you're right. And I want to just add to that, you've experienced this locally, and you alluded to it earlier. When you're engaged in politics in your own community, the people with whom you're disagreeing are not crazy. They're just your neighbor who has a different opinion. And I hope folks will keep that in mind and recognize that as they are involved in politics, it can feel really good when we see that clap back on Twitter. But in practice, right, those sort of like snappy retorts don't actually work well in trying to build up a success. And I hope that as folks participate more, they recognize that it's much more effective to be kind and to be polite. That doesn't mean compromise on your values, but it does mean be comfortable when the conversation is over, pivoting to a conversation about where you're going on vacation when COVID is over, or what your kids are up to. And I've noticed that in my interaction with constituents, some have got that figured out and others frankly don't. And they're rude in the way that they talk with me. And it's unfortunate because it's not convincing, right? When someone is being rude to you, you kind of stop taking them very seriously. So I hope that as people participate more, and I hope that they will, people will recognize that we overwhelmingly want similar things in our community, and the best way to get there is to work together, and at the very least recognize that folks who have a different opinion are also members of the community, are also people, and deserve to be treated well, if not to capture power out of treating people well, just for the sake of doing it. Eitan, listen, I really appreciate you joining me today. I know this isn't your typical interview. You said before we filmed that maybe you've got a question or two for me, so we're running out of time. You got it, I'm ready.
So, you kind of alluded to it at the end, but I would say that I would ask you, you've held many roles in the community already, but they have different roles, and I want more advice for me and for my fellow Brookline residents of ways that you think are most productive to be involved, and ways that are not so productive to be involved.
Yeah, I think that what I have found, there's some people I have observed are remarkably effective, and I'll mention just one, Hugh Madison. And Hugh Madison, not all of his traits are necessarily peaches and cream. One thing he does really well, he decides he's going to change something. It is not the biggest thing everyone is talking about. It is something that, for whatever reason, is interesting and important to him. And he decides not to change it by next week. he decides to change it within the next 5 to 10 years. And he recognizes that he's not going to get it changed next week, that instead he has to spend a lot of time educating himself and then educating others without bashing them over the head with it, but just helping them to come along. And by the time he makes his move, he's already lined up the support. He essentially already knows he's going to win because he's done the work ahead of time. It's work. Making productive change is work, and it's work you cannot do by yourself. And so build a team. I like positivity rather than sort of, malicious use of power. Maybe that works for others. I'm intrigued by the idea, and recognize it's going to take some time. I've observed in Brookline for local politics, anyone who's decided they want to achieve something, if they've been working on it 3 or 4 years and they've really been working on it, they're just about ready to achieve it. I've not seen someone fail if they've really worked at something for several years in a way that is not acerbic, that is not willfully negative toward others. Because eventually people hear about it enough times that it just becomes a normal, reasonable thing, and they'll give it a shot. They'll go for it if it's money in the budget, if it's a policy. Where I think people go wrong is they try to achieve it by next week, and they get angry with people who are not with 100% on their side. And those things tend to flame out pretty quickly and have tough outcomes. It's hard for people to have that kind of patience. But the fact of the matter is, change involves getting a whole bunch of people to do something different the way you want them to. They're not doing it now. You've got to convince them, and you've generally got to convince them 1 or 2 at a time. So if you want change, figure out exactly what it is that you want, and you don't have to be singularly focused on it, but you've got to be constantly working at it, taking every opportunity with the select board or advisory committee or whatever the appropriate place is to bring up your issue and to be kind and gentle about it, to allow other people the opportunity to come to it. You can pull on them a little bit, but if you're banging people over the head, they're going to stop listening. And so that's not just, I don't know how to get things done quickly. I know how to get things done eventually, which is better than not at all. And so sometimes you're working on more than one thing at one time. So if you're getting everything done eventually, you're getting something done, now and again. And I'm sure there are people who know how to do things more quickly. I know how to do things eventually. That's how I've gone about doing them.
Thank you. I think that's good advice. I think that really resonates. So thank you for sharing it.
And I will say, nobody lives in Brookline forever. And so if you think you're going to be living in Brookline for the next 30 years, you can outlast almost everybody. So take your time, build up relationships and build trust from your community on the thing that you care about and the thing that you want to see change, and you'll get there. I hope, unless it's a terrible idea, and then hopefully people are very polite to you and you never get where you want to go. But
I think that's one
that's
way
the deal, right? That's politics.
Yeah, and I think as one goes around and tries to sell something, and they're not just trying to get something off their chest or make a point, you also learn how people are reacting to you and say, oh, okay, so, I thought I was right here, but you seem to be, I'm looking at you eye to eye, and you seem to be not liking this part of it. And that helps me re-examine what I believe and get to a point where you can build consensus, as opposed to, I think what happens a lot with the hobbyists online, where the goal is really never to listen and make progress. It's to emote, it's to express. And okay, if that's your goal, then, just like I have expressions that I have about what Tom Brady did and, who Chaim Bloom hires next for the Red Sox. And I have opinions about that, but I don't have control over that. And in a situation where I want to have some control, I need to look someone else in the eye and try to understand not just what they think, what their interests are, but how they react to what I'm proposing.
Now, that said, and I want to just sort of put a little context in it, and then we're gonna say goodbye for the day. Brookline in particular loves process. And at some point, you got to make a decision and move on, right? And so process is important to build consensus. Many times there are decisions where you can try something, and if it doesn't work, you can revisit it, right? Sometimes I feel like we polish, and there's an opportunity cost. We could have taken an action, seen how it went, and while we were collecting data on this first thing, be working on this other thing, maybe accomplish two things instead of just one. And so, I want to encourage people to take a long view and to build support for it. But don't accept the idea that if we don't know everything about the possible outcomes, we can't do anything. Do not allow that paralysis. Work your issue, build support, and get the community willing to take an action. We've got to take some chances. We've got to try some things out. And we've got to be willing to wind it back if it's not working. I think sometimes in many communities, certainly in Brookline, we get this decision paralysis where unless we can find the perfect outcome that in which it's sort of a Pareto where everybody involved has to be better off or we can't do it, we don't do anything. And to be clear, when we're in this position where if we can't make everyone better off, we don't do anything, we are being structurally racist. And that's a big thing to say. But the status quo exists because the folks who were in power over the last several hundred years created the status quo we have now. And if we refuse to change it because we can't find something that's better for everyone, we're accepting that, that this guy had it right and he didn't. Some things he had right, some things he didn't. And so, again, build up your support and keep working your issue. But we as a community have to be willing to move forward on things and not say, this is how we've always done it. It's a perfect option. We can't do anything because that really sells our community short and it particularly harms those who historically have had the least power. And that's not the values of our community, but sometimes our actions get that outcome anyway. So, a little yin, a little yang. It's not always so easy to get it right, but keep working at it and keep talking to folks about it.
Thanks. I agree.
Well, listen, Eitan Hersh, Politics is for Power. Definitely check it out. Think about it. It's okay to be a political hobbyist. Just know, have some self-actualization. Know that's what you're doing.
And let me just encourage anyone who's watching this. The issues and the communities here that I'm spending my time on, we know because we just did a big survey of Brookline residents, and we'll have data on this, that the public really wants some changes in how our police department is run. And we know that many, many people, particularly younger people, are having a really hard time with affordability in Brookline, but frankly, everywhere within a commuting distance from Boston. We know the public on both these issues is with us on a survey, but they're not there in town meeting. They're not there among the people who are willing to show up. I use this example. I go, give interviews all around the country, and I talk about the fact that we had lots of Black Lives Matter protests here in Brookline. And then when our task force to reimagining policing had a public hearing, 100% of the written comments were from folks who said the police department is perfect, don't change a thing. And my reaction to that is, where are all these people who were out there with me? I know they were there at the steps of the library. I know they care about it, but we need to get a lot more people on these issues especially. So I would really welcome folks to check out the work we're doing in the task force reimagining policing. Come to one of our Brookline for Everyone meetings about affordable housing. I think you'll learn a lot, and we need you.
And you might discover that Eitan's got it all wrong, but at least you'll know so who you should be working with to defeat Eitan in the next big political battle in Brookline.
That's right.
And hey, that's kind of the point, right? We are a democracy. We share power and we debate, and ultimately, it's not the best ideas that win. It's the ideas that are most strongly supported that win. And that can be hard to chew on, but there it is. You've been watching Brookline Interactive Group. I'm Tommy Vitolo. Thank you, Eitan Hersh, for joining us, and we will see you next week with, who knows, we'll find somebody to come on this show.